Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast that helps you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and on this episode, I'm going to be revealing my top 30 defenders likely to be available in your redrafts ahead of the 2026 season. For anyone new to the podcast, firstly, welcome. It's great to have you on board for season 2026. And hopefully you caught the first episode of the year last week with draft expert Dylan Alexander. He joined me to go through the best keeper prospects from the 2025 draft. And if you missed it and want to know who to target, I'd suggest you go and check it out. It was a great chat, great episode that went into detail on all the kids coming through. But today I'm starting a ranking season here on Finders Keepers, starting with the defenders. And my rankings are a bit different to the usual rankings you'd see this time of year, as I'm only ranking players I believe are likely to be unowned in your leagues. So these are guys that were delisted at the end of last year or whenever your leagues have done your delisting. Or maybe they've just never been owned and relevant before now. And that's what I love looking at this group of players, the pool, because so much can change in one off-season. A player might change clubs or pick up a new role or any number of factors that contribute to a player who is previously unwanted now becoming relevant. Or depending on the size of your leagues and how many players you get to keep, they may be players that were desperately wanted but just couldn't be squeezed into that final list, meaning they're open to everyone now. So for the purposes of these rankings and the podcast in general, I am basing this on a 30-player keeper league squad, which keeps 15 players year on year, and using a common on-field formation of 5 defenders, 7 midfielders, 1 ruck, and 5 forwards. The criteria for this list is any defender who averaged less than 75 in season 2025. And of course, I'm not going to include any of the 2025 draftees. If you want to know more about them, as I said, go check out the episode from last week with Dylan Alexander. I've got a list of 30 defenders who I think are likely to be available in your redrafts. And this is the order I would rank them in, taking into consideration all the variables that face us in keeper leagues. Whether or not you're challenging for a premiership this year, down the bottom rebuilding, looking for youth. I've taken all of that into consideration, and these are the 30 names I've landed on. Number 1, Andy McGrath from Essendon. Now this is a guy that you could probably make the argument he would be owned in most leagues, but he's 27 and he's probably been a little bit of a tease over the years, and last year he averaged 75, and that was nearly a 10-point drop on the season before. It was his worst season since 2019 in terms of average for the season. So I just think there's a good chance that coaches would have become frustrated and let him go last year. And I'm expecting a big bounce back in 2026. He's just named the captain of Essendon. He's someone that's averaged, in the 80s for a good 4 or 5 years before last year. And there was something I saw last year when Essendon didn't have a midfield by the end of the season with all their injuries. And they threw McGrath in there at the centre bounces, and he did all right, and he scored all right. Now, I don't think that's going to continue. He'll go back to his original position in the back line. But I just feel like this season, as captain, he's going to step up and get back to his 80, 85 average. And if he's available in your pool, he's still young enough to grab him now and enjoy the last 5 years or so of his career. Number 2 is actually someone who was number 2 in my list last year, but I'm even more excited about what this guy can do. And it's Josh Weddle from Hawthorn, who averaged 70 last season from his 15 games. And I really feel like before he got injured and missed the rest of the season from, I think, round 15, 16, he put together a 5 or 6 week period where he was scoring 80s most weeks. And he's an interesting player because he then got injured. He hurt his back and was pretty much ruled out for the season. So I reckon there'd be a lot of leagues where coaches had him, were happy with what he was doing, but once he got injured, they thought, no, I'll just let him go and have a look at him next year. And then he came back and played in Hawthorn's final series and looked okay. So I think he's going to be available in a lot of leagues. I love what I see from him. We need to know what his position is going to be long term because he's a bit of a all-rounder. But there is an absolute gap in that Hawthorn midfield. They tried to get Zach Merritt across. They lost James Worpel. And recent news, unfortunately, poor Will Days hurt his shoulder again. And Weddle's been training with the midfield. So I'm quite optimistic that he'll be used in the midfield at times this year, as well as his usual role in the back line and even going forward at times. But I just think at 21 years of age, the size of him, given a bit of midfield opportunity, he's going to have a career season and be a guy that everyone wants, and I'm pretty bullish on him. Number 3 is Lockie Cowan from Carlton. 21 years of age, just finished his 3rd season, and even though he only averaged 63, he had a breakout season for me. He looked good early in the year, and then I think he had an injury, maybe a concussion even, and missed a game, and then he was in the twos, and then he was sort of in and out a little bit, played as a sub at times, but he played all of the last 8 games and averaged 80 or just under 80 in that time. And I think that's more of what you can expect from him for this year and onwards. He's really become a big part of that back six, and there was talk, last pre-season, I know I had him on this in my rankings last season, a little bit further down, but there was a feeling that he could be the main man back there, especially with Doherty now retired and Adam Sard probably not far away from the same. Nick Newman returns, we know that, but I just think Lockie Cowan finished the year really strong, and I'd be really, I'd be surprised if he didn't play every game this year and average around the 80 mark. Speaking of his teammate, Nick Newman, at number 4, the 32-year-old returns from a season out of the game, and that injury that ruled out his 2025 was such a shame, because 2024 he averaged just about 103, playing that really nice role we like, and I think he returns to that once he's back in the side, and I guess we should temper expectations a bit. He's another year older and he's missed a whole season, but definitely if he's sitting in your pools as a delisted guy from last year and you're in the window looking to attack for a premiership this year, he's definitely the sort of guy you want to grab if he's there. Number 5 is second-year player Finn O'Sullivan from North Melbourne. Very high draft pick. Would have been very popular in the drafts, keeper drafts as well this time last year. And I thought he looked all right at times. He averaged his 54 from 22 games. So he only missed 1 game in his debut season. Pretty impressive for a youngster. And I think sometimes we can be pretty impatient. We've been quite blessed with kids who come in and score right from the start. And I reckon there'd be some coaches who grabbed him early last year, didn't really like what they saw in terms of output and have let him go. So if he's been cut loose, grab him because he's going to be a jet down the track. They had a look at him a little bit off half back at times. We might see more of that this year. But yeah, someone like that sitting in your pool, you've got to grab him and see. Number 6 is Caleb Windsor for Melbourne. Coming into his 3rd season now, I think I expect him of his average last year, which ended up at 54. I think the curious thing with him was, he's sort of been playing wing, half-back, and I think that's where we see him long-term. But Melbourne were experimenting with him at centre bounces late last year, and I've heard so far in the pre-season he spent a bit of time training with the mids again. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting year for him, but I know long-term he's going to be a real fantasy guy. And again, he could be someone that was drafted and held for a couple of years and has now been cut loose. And if that's the case, grab him. Coming in at number 7 is poor old Jordan Ridley. Oh, man. If this guy ever just got a season or two without those bloody hamstring injuries, he'd be right up there. The season before last, 2024, in games where he wasn't injury affected, he averaged 96. And last year he started to show it at times, but the injuries got him again. So his average was only 63. He's 27 years old. I reckon there'd be a lot of fed up coaches who've just grown impatient of waiting for him to be reliable and would have cut him loose. If, and it's a big if, we know, he can get those hamstrings right and he can get through a full season, I can see him being one of the top averaging defenders you can get. So I think he's worth the risk. Grab him and hope for the best. Number 8 is Jason Burgoyne for Port Adelaide. Coming into his 5th season, this will be. He's been an interesting player. I've been very excited by him in the last few years at times, but it does appear that he really needs to be off half-back for him to be what we want. And the really interesting thing about him is, I think 12 months ago he lost defender status, so he was mid-only. He's actually got it back during the season and kept it now. So he's still, well, obviously he's got defender status, so he wouldn't be on this episode if he didn't. But with defender status and a new coach at Port Adelaide, if they could keep him away from the wing and keep him in that back 50 as the rebounder, he could be a real get. 74 average, which is slightly down on the year before. But I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do this year, and I reckon there would have been some that let him go because as a mid-only, he's much less valuable. But he's a defender again, so let's see what he can do. Number 9, I cannot believe this guy is on the list. Dan Houston. What an unbelievable fall from fantasy grace in his first season at Collingwood, averaging just 67. And I don't know what it was exactly. The role was, close enough, and obviously Collingwood aren't as fantasy friendly perhaps as Port Adelaide were, but that was a shocking year fantasy-wise for him, and I put him on this list because if he's available, I'd be grabbing him because there's no way he's that bad again. I think we sometimes see players who are well established who move to another club. In the fantasy world, we expect a big season in the new colours. Sometimes it takes a year or two for them to find their way, and I'd be putting everything I have on Houston being much better than a 67 average guy. And yeah, he's not going to... It's unlikely he's ever going to reach the heights he had at Port Adelaide, but at 28 years old, well, he's an 80 guy at least for the next few years. So let's wait and see there. Number 10, rounding out the top 10, is Kadeen Coleman from Brisbane, 25 years old now, and has spent the last 2 seasons really watching from the sidelines. I think the first year was a ACL, and then there were complications and issues he had last year. He's really interesting, and he'd be such a frustrating own in keeper leagues because that end of 2023 season, he finished the last third of that year really, really strong, scoring well in that rebounding role off half-back. And then we all know what he did in the grand final that year. He was on 100 at half-time and on track for a Norm Smith medal. But he's been barely seen since, and he's looking good for opening round this season, but that backline at Brisbane's pretty full. You got Zorko doing incredible things for his age. Darcy Wilmot had a great year. He's developing really strong, and Jasper Fletcher went back there. So it's going to be hard for him to find a spot, but I do think he will, and all going well with his body, he should be that guy we saw at the end of 2023. So it's going to be very painful if you owned him and let him go last year and then someone else grabs him and he does become the player we thought he would. But you got to grab him and see. I think it's going to take a while, and he might even start in the forward line, I think I saw, which, it's not going to be good scoring early, but hang in there. He's still young. Number 11 is Lawson Humphreys from Geelong, 22 years old, just coming off his second season. He was so impressive in that 2024 season for Geelong. And last year he was great. He just didn't build on that average. So he landed on a 70 average again. But that's tracking in the right direction still. A consolidation year in season 2. Watch for a spike maybe in season 3. And I think he's going to go on to be a real fantasy gun. Number 12 is Chenkuth Giath, who finds himself in new colours this year at Melbourne. Coming off an average of 54 last year, he's 26 now, and he's a very exciting player to watch when he has that dashing halfback role. And Hawthorn, for whatever reason, didn't probably like him in that role, or they didn't persevere, and he's off to greener pastures now. And I think he's going to get that role at Melbourne and be kind of what we thought he'd be a few years ago, a really one of those players that's just great to have because he's great to watch when they're playing. And he's going to be a good scorer, and he's going to improve on his 54 average this year, definitely. Number 13 is another player who's changed clubs, Judd McVie, who's crossed over to Freo from Melbourne. His average was around the 50s as well last year, and Melbourne used him as a lockdown guy. I think he sees himself as more of a distributor, and I can see him forming a bit of a partnership with Jordan Clark at the Dockers and scoring pretty well this year. And he's 22, so very young, big future. Number 14 is Dan Rioli at Gold Coast, who he's 28 and the Premiership Tiger. He came across, and I expected more than a 71 average from him last year. And perhaps the season from John Noble probably took some of the points off him. That was a bit of a surprise. I thought Rioli would have a better year than Noble did. But as I said earlier, like when a player changes clubs, sometimes it can take a while. I think he's worth a punt. Like he could score really well in that halfback role. For the Suns, it's just about that consistency. Number 15 is Luke Traynor from Richmond. Entering his second season, I was so impressed by him last year. He only averaged 55, so on paper it doesn't look great, but he looked really good when he was in that back line. The issue we had, and this is for those playing in the classic form, the salary cap game, is he was just made sub quite suddenly and randomly, it seemed, and then they tried him in the forward line, and they moved him around a bit, but I'd like to see him just settle in the back line this year and really start to build, and I think he's going to be a fantasy gun down the track. It's just about how many years before he locks away that spot and starts doing it consistently. Number 16, I've got Toby Travalia for St Kilda. So a similar story, second season. He played a lot of games, just didn't really show much of the fantasy stuff. Probably sub-affected, but an average of 46 for the season. But he's a guy that was hyped up 12 months ago as a fantasy prospect, and he's a great example, like Finn O'Sullivan earlier in the list, someone that was drafted last year, but the coach didn't get the fantasy output straight away, and they've let him go back into the pack. So if he's there, he's worth having a crack at. I think he's going to get more opportunity and improve this season. Number 17 is the mature age recruit last year, Riley Bice for Sydney. 25 years old. His average was 57 in the end, which I'm sure there was sub games there. But he made a real splash when he arrived. He scored a 125 in his third game, and he just looked to be the next big thing out of nowhere. But, it didn't last, and he ended up losing his spot, and then he was a sub a few times. I've just got him on this list because they've got a bit of working out to do, Sydney. Matt Roberts was moved around. He was moved to the wing. Callum Mills coming in and playing halfback probably affects, Bice's opportunities and Matty Roberts as well. But, I think Callum Mills plays as a midfielder this year, and I think there's going to be a spot there, and we know Bice can score. So if he gets the role, he's going to be a gun. Number 18 is Joe Fonte from the Giants. Now, I don't think he's ever really put up any numbers in the fantasy world, but he's just a guy that passes the eye test, as we like to say. Every time I've watched the Giants last year, and I caught glimpses of this guy, I've just thought, he's going to be a real goer. The way he moves, the way he finds the ball, and he's just the sort of guy that he's going to pop up at some point with some scores, and this is an opportunity now to just grab him, put him away, and wait for that, rather than, I'll have a look and see how the year progresses, and then he starts to score and everyone's scrambling for him on the waiver wire. I like him a lot, and looking forward to seeing what he can do this season. Number 19 is a similar type, Riley Hardiman for North Melbourne. He's 20 and, his average was 48, so nothing on paper, but he had a couple of big games where he looked really good. And North Melbourne have a lot of guys that they play in that halfback role. They had Fisher there the year before. They brought Caleb Daniel across. Colby McKirch has been used there. I even heard Zane Dersma might be tried there. Finn O'Sullivan's been tried there. But I just think Hardiman, if he gets the role and he gets the spot there, there's a fantasy scorer in him. And I'm sure a few of you would have noticed that last year when he had a couple of big scores, but then faded. Number 20 is Brady Hoff for West Coast. Average 64. He's 22. And he's an interesting player because he hasn't really put it together in fantasy terms, but I don't know. I feel like we all kind of still think he's got a fantasy game in him. And last year they tried him in the midfield at centre bounces for a large part of the year. And I thought he looked pretty good in there. In fact, I reckon he looks good whenever I watch him play. It's just about whether he can get the right role that's going to allow him to accumulate and score for us. But he's a good player, and I reckon he could go. I reckon this is a big year for him. And as West Coast hopefully continue to improve and those kids start to develop around him, I reckon this could be a big year for the Hoff. Number 21, Connor O'Sullivan at Geelong. I love this kid. He played nearly every game last year in his second season on the list, and his intercept marking is such an asset, and I think it's what's going to make him a really good fantasy player. It's going to be probably a few years before he's fantasy relevant and consistent scorer, and maybe it's something like a Tom Stewart retiring, or, hand over the reins, but I'm just very convinced on this kid that he's going to be good in fantasy. It's just, do you grab him now and sit on him for a few years, or do you wait and see? But I've got him on this list because I really rate him. Number 22 is Angus Clark for Essendon. He came in last year and he looked pretty good. I mean, Essendon tried, nearly every player on their list, let's be honest, last year with the amount of injuries they had. And I like the look of this guy. They uncovered a few good ones, and Clark is definitely one of them. The only thing is, it could be a while before he gets as much opportunity as he did last year with a full, if they've got a healthy list, Essendon. But I like the look of this guy, and I reckon he can do something. It'll just be if he gets the opportunities again this year. Number 23, I've got Connor Iden, it's just a very vanilla pick. Averaged 73 last year. I think he just averages around that most seasons. He's pretty reliable. He'll pop a decent score every now and then. And, if he's your last defender or your backup, I think you're pretty happy with that. Number 24, Jackson Pryor. He came across to the Bombers last year and showed at times a fantasy game. The reason he's on here, I probably wouldn't have looked too much at him, but I think I've seen in the preseason he's been spending a bit of time on the wing, which means it's more of a freer role. And I reckon this guy, when he's free and not as accountable, he can find the footy and score all right. So he's a bit of a watch for me. Number 25, Ryan Burns at St Kilda. I've never really known what to make of Burns. Every now and then he'll pop up with a decent score. He sort of plays wing outside, I think, and at times can be a distributor off half-back. I mean, he's kept the defensive status. That's the only reason he's still on my radar, and the fact that he's 24 years old. So, yeah, I'm not too convinced. I think they delisted and redrafted him. So, his spot in the 23 isn't secure at all for St Kilda. He's just another guy. Let's keep an eye on, see if I hear anything in pre-season about his role, and just see if there's any argument I can make that he could get that average over 70, which I don't think he's done yet in his career. Number 26, just down to our last 5 now, Harry Perryman at Collingwood. What do you say about Harry Perryman? I had him, I think, at number 1 on this list this time last year. He was coming across from the Giants. I thought there'd be a bit of a midfield role for him, and I know that we knew he could score in the right role at the Giants. A bit like Houston, it just wasn't. Collingwood just weren't the points crazy, the fantasy crazy side that I guess the Giants could have been in the past. But yeah, I didn't expect an average of 63. That was beyond disappointing. But second year at the Pies, and they did use him in the middle. They used him at halfback. I just wouldn't be surprised if he popped up this year with an 80 average, or maybe that's a bit generous. Maybe in the 70s, high 70s, because you just know he can. He's 27, and yeah, crazy poor season fantasy-wise. Has to be better this year. Number 27 is Will Powell for Gold Coast. He had an average of 67. And he averaged 80-something a few years ago. So he's had a lot of injuries and interruptions. I really thought he'd do better last year. The problem with Gold Coast, and I touched on this when I spoke about Rioli, is they've got John Noble there, they've got Rioli there, Will Powell can play that role, Lockie Weller when he's up and going. They've just got so many guys off half-back, and I think it just means some of these guys will play a bit more lockdown, and that obviously really cruels their fantasy scoring. I don't know, with Powell, I'm probably ready to give up on him, but let's say one more chance and see what he can do this year. His teammate comes in at number 28, and that's Mac Andrew, who I was really bullish on 12 months ago, but also flagged that it could be a few years till we saw it. And this year, he averaged 56, really just playing that key defensive spot. But I think at 22 years of age, the size of him, he's only going to get better. And even though he will be a key defender, I do think he's the sort that, with his intercepting game, he's going to be a fantasy guy still. It just might still be a few years away. Number 29 is Wayne Miller from Adelaide. And look, he achieved something he's only done once before in his career, and that's play over 20 games in a season. And I think that's the really important thing, that he got a season under his belt, averaged in the 70s. Yeah, he averaged 72. Had some big games, had some very quiet games. The only issue with Miller as a fantasy prospect now, like, he's 28, so it's getting harder and harder to see this big fantasy breakout. And yeah, he may just be a 70s guy, and that's it, and that's still good, and that's fine. It's just, yeah, I'm a Crows fan. I had such high hopes for him, and Yeah, but look, he's a great player, and he's got that season behind him now. Fingers crossed he can stay fit and get that average up a bit higher than just 72. Number 30 and lucky last is Josh Battle for Hawthorn. He averaged 70 in his first season as a Hawk. He's 27 years old, reliable, solid defender who, will have games where he's nowhere near it, and then he'll have games where he takes heaps of marks and, puts up a good score. He's just really reliable, not a bad guy to have as backup, and don't see his average really changing this year. I just think he's pretty solid and someone you can bank on 70s from most weeks. And that's my 30. Big list. And you know what? I don't usually do this. I probably won't make a habit of it, but I did have some special mentions. I just feel like there are a handful of players I could easily have snuck in, in that last half a dozen. Guys like Sam DeConning at Geelong, who scores really, really well when they run him as the ruck. And they did that early last year, and he had some great scores, but then he moved back to the back line. And I don't know. If you just get any whisper that he will be a ruck again, he's, he could be a gun. A few other names. Someone like Ruben Jinby really impresses me. Not yet in the fantasy sense. He's become a key back and doing a really good job for the Eagles. I just think in time he's going to develop into a pretty reliable scorer as well. And then just Mitch Hinge for the Crows was always pretty reliable in the 70s and 80s, but last year came right down to a 67 average. I think he'll improve on that. And Heath Chapman gets on this list just because of the potential. And if they ever release him as a distributor and not such a lockdown, he's a guy I'd be very interested in as well. Hopefully I've given you some pretty good names and some ideas on how to attack your redrafts, particularly for those targeting defenders. Such an interesting position, the defender. It, for many years, was very fruitful and still is. I've found in the last few years, finding a reliable defender that you can, as a real primo that you can bank on, it's just got a little bit harder in recent years, and I don't know why that is. I can't put my finger on why. But what I do know is uncovering the next superstar defender is never been more important in keeper and dynasty leagues, and hopefully I've mentioned one or two of them in this list today and you're able to jump on. Let me know what you think too, if the list is about right, if there's any names I've missed or put in the wrong spot. Would love any feedback, good and bad. Find the page on X at FindKeepAFL. Like the page and stay up to date with everything that's happening on the podcast. Next week on Finders Keepers, I'll be doing my midfielder ranks, doing the same thing I've done here, looking at a pool of players I think will be likely to be available in your leagues and ranking them based on all the different factors that we take into consideration as keeper and dynasty coaches when we're approaching our redrafts. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you check it out. Don't forget to go back and listen to last week's episode, Rookies with Dylan, where we looked at the 2025 draft crop and identified the best prospects for keeper and dynasty leagues. Thanks for listening. I look forward to next week talking midfielders. Don't miss it. And in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.